My name is Whitney Hull, and I'm with UVM Extension, and I'm in charge of the Dairy Herd Management Technical Assistance Program. So today we're going to talk a little bit about using dairy herd records to make management decisions on your farm. So records analysis is a great way to look at where we've been historically in the herd and also where do we want to go. So I like to kind of look at what has happened historically. So what have we been looking at for trends over the past 6 months, over the past year, several years in the herd? Is there a specific issue that you want to be able to track, that you want to know where you've been? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? You can also look at what's changed recently in the herd. Have you made a management change? Is it improving things? Is it making things a little bit more difficult to track? What has production done? There's all sorts of different metrics that you're able to look at to sort of figure out kind of what the overall trends in the herd have been. And it's a great way for accountability and goal setting. So if you have a farm management team or a group of people on the farm that are trying to move benchmarks forward, it's great to have a starting point, and it's great to be able to track how things have changed month to month, quarterly, yearly. Lots of great ways to use herd management records on the farm. So this is just a brief snapshot. If any of you are using dairy herd DHMTA test, you'll probably be familiar with this page. This is the 202 sheet. If you're not using DHMTA test, there's still some valuable info that you can kind of apply to your herd going forward. So I've highlighted, it might be difficult to see, but I've highlighted in black boxes some of the main things that might be areas of focus to look at when you get this sheet. So the first one I've highlighted is this somatic cell. So it breaks it down by lactation on the left-hand side, and it will tell you the number of animals that are in each of those groups. So you can find the number of animals in each stage of lactation on the top, and then in these boxes, it will tell you what the actual somatic cell scores are, or the raw counts of animals in that group. So you can see that the second lactation animals between 1 to 40 days in milk have a count of 967. So arguably that's pretty high. Whether that's high for this herd or if that's just a one-off animal that's causing that to be really high, it kind of gives you an area where you can say, this looks a little bit suspicious to me. Can we dig into this data for second lactation cows and figure out whether it's just one animal, whether it's a group of animals, what's causing that change? So the second thing that I like to look at is how many cows entered the herd versus how many left. So that can give you a good idea of, is the herd growing? Are they trying to reduce overcrowding, reduce size? You can look at, again, it breaks it on the far left side. This part is dry cows, and this part is cows entered and cows left. So it will give you the number of cows in the first lactation that entered and left. And then you can also see that it looks like they bought some mature cows as well. So generally, if you're trying to maintain the relative herd size, you're going to see the numbers of cows that entered and the numbers that left to be pretty similarly matched. It looks like potentially this herd is trying to reduce herd size based on the number of animals that left the herd compared to the number of animals that entered in. It's also a good way to track, does this herd buy in a lot of animals and not raise replacements? Or if they're purchasing a lot of animals, maybe they're trying to increase the herd size, or they've bought another herd and are combining two herds. And it also gives you the ability to look at, why did the animals leave? So if you see, that a lot of animals left for disease or died, it can maybe be a sign that you could dig into that data a little bit deeper, have some more questions about, what was the cause of death? Exactly why are those animals leaving the herd? And is that a normal instance for the herd, or is it something that's abnormal? So another thing that I think pretty much everyone looks at is milk production. So this is accounting for test day averages. There's a lot of information here, a lot of stuff to weed through, but basically you're looking at number of animals in the herd. This is your date that you tested. It will tell you how many days between test periods. This is the days in milk average of the herd. So ideally the goal would be 150 days, but it's nice to be able to look at that and see, do we have kind of a seasonality effect going on in the herd? Is there a particular time of year where they're higher in days in milk and then lower at another point? You can also see that this herd had a big jump in production compared to from one test to the next, they jumped about 11 pounds in milk. So that's significant. So as someone who looks at dairy records a lot, that would prompt me to ask, what happened? Did we make a management change? Did we get rid of a lot of animals? So you can look at the number of cows in the herd on test day and the column in green, and you can say, yeah, they did get rid of a lot of cows. So did we increase in milk because it was a cow comfort issue? So now that we depopulated the barn slightly, are cows more comfortable? And that led to an increase in milk production. You can also look and see that cows increased on components during that same amount of time. It didn't quite carry through consistently. So one thing to be aware of, if you see a lot of noise or a lot of jumping back and forth from high production to low production, high fat and protein to low fat and protein, maybe we need to ask, what time of day are we testing? Is it an AM one month and a PM the next month? That can create a lot of noise in the data. So just something to be aware of. I always caution you shouldn't make sweeping culling decisions based on just one test day worth of milk. You want to have enough data there that you feel confident that this cow is truly ready to be culled from the herd. So this is another example of the 202 page. This page actually comes first, I think, in your summary that you get from DHIA. So a couple things to look at here. I'm looking a little bit more at the repro stuff on this sheet. So you can see number of cows open over 100 days. So, depending on what your management style is as far as voluntary waiting period for cows, I generally have a rule of thumb, as long as she's had a service by 100 days in milk, we're pretty safe. So you can see this herd has about 10 cows at this point that are still open. So conception rate is another one that's big to look at. Generally, industry standard is around 40%. So this herd would be a little bit below that benchmark. So that would prompt us to ask, what would be contributing to that lower conception rate? Is there something that we could do to tweak that conception rate to bring it up? If you look at the reproductive summary, you can see the percentage of heats observed, which is pretty good, and their preg rate. So overall, they're really not doing bad, but could we tweak a few things to be able to kind of get them to that next level? So this is a graph that you can pull out of PC Dart. This is just rolling herd average milk, fat, and protein. And I know it's a little bit fuzzy, but generally this looks like it's about 18 months, but within PC Dart, you can have a graph of 3 years. So you can get some nice historical data just in a visual presentation. So you can see, what's the trend over time? Have things gotten better? Have they gotten worse? Can we pinpoint on this graph, where we might have made management changes that led to either an increase or a decrease? This is another similar graph. This one is just looking at peak milk. So this breaks it out into mature cows, second plus, and first lactation. So generally, you'd like to see your first lactation animals to be about 75 to 85% of mature cow peak. So this is just kind of a graph that's showing how closely they're comparing to their mature herd mates. And it can be a nice way to, start a discussion if you're having issues with first lactation animals peaking or mature cows peaking. It can be just a nice visual to see or to confirm kind of what you've been witnessing throughout the herd. And this is pulled out of Dairy Comp 305. So if you have daily milk weights within your herd, if you're using Dairy Comp 305, this is a nice, easy to pull up report that can kind of show you on a by pen basis what's going on in the herd. And it's a little bit noisy, but you can see pen, what the actual percentage of animals in the pen, actual number of animals, what the average daily milks are. So that would be the past 24 hours of milk. Milk deviation, which would mean, is she performing at or below or above what we expect her to be? So negative would be, we expected her to give more, she's not quite giving us what we thought. Positive would be, we expected her to give less, so she's overachieving from what this system is estimating she'll be at. It'll give you the average daily milk or average days in milk, weekly milk deviation. So that would be the last 7 days, and her average weekly milk, again, last 7 days. So this is if you have parlor milk weights that are coming into Dairy Comp 305. PC-DART has the ability to do the same thing. So just giving you another option for how you might be able to manage if you've got daily milk weights within your herd that's also communicating with your record system. So those are just a few of the different ways that we can use herd records to help you make management decisions on the farm. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to pop them in the chat or go ahead and share them now or at the end of the other presentations. And you can always click on the link. I'd be happy to talk more with anybody about how we can use herd management data on your farm. So with that, I will open it up for questions or pass it on to Kelsie.
I have a question, Whitney.
Sure.
So for cows entering and leaving the herd, cows entering, it's not like if you're raising your own replacement heifers, those aren't counted as entering the herd. Is that counted separately?
They'll count as entering the herd when they enter the lactation. So when they go from being just a calf or a heifer to entering the milking string, that will show as entering the herd.
Okay, gotcha. All right, if there's no other questions, I'll introduce myself. I'm Kelsie Meehan, and I am also part of the Dairy Herd Management Technical Assistance Program. I work with smaller dairies and pasture-based dairies. So my work is centered in the in UVM's Center for Sustainable Agriculture. And I have some slides on grazing record keeping.
Trying to pull those up, Kelsie.
Okay, I can also share my screen too, if that's easier. I have them right here.
Okay, do you want to share your screen?
Yes, okay. Screen. Is that working?
No.
No. Oh, here we go. Right. Is that good now?
Yep.
Okay. Let's see. All right, I'm going to be talking about some different methods for grazing record keeping. So why is it useful to keep grazing records? One of the main reasons will be to plan out your feed needs, to see if you have enough pasture and or supplemental feed across the whole of the grazing season and the whole year. This graphic here shows production levels of cool and warm season grasses over the course of the year. So if we look at the lighter green cool season grasses that we have here in Vermont, we can see that there's a summer slump that happens late July, early August. When things get hot, the grass will slow down its growth or even stop growing altogether. And so making a grazing plan is a way to look ahead, to plan for that summer slump, to make sure you've got enough and a good consistent feed supply. So ways to mitigate that might be to increase supplemental feed, graze hay fields after a first or second cutting. So you're essentially expanding the amount of land that you're grazing as the season progresses. And or you can decrease the amount of time spent on pasture later in the season. So in August, you might be grazing only at night, and that will decrease the amount of feed you're getting from pasture. And it can also address issues of heat stress during that hot time of the year, just grazing at night. Some other reasons to keep grazing records. So you can plan ahead for haying and clipping. You can find the optimum timeframes to make hay or to just clip and leave it that allow for adequate pasture regrowth, and will also maximize the palatability and the nutritional content of that pasture. You can use grazing planning, planning ahead around important events. So this could be needing animals to be in certain paddocks close to the barn or at certain times of year, or it could also be for planning around if you planning on going on vacation and need the animals to be in a certain place, and because someone else is going to be moving them. And lastly, you can use grazing records to look back and track and measure changes over time, observe changes in pasture productivity. Hopefully you're seeing an increase in productivity as, as you're continuing to rotationally graze. You can document the effects of amendments, so lime, fertilizers, and seeding. You can observe changes in weather patterns. A lot of folks are seeing that turnout date is getting sooner and sooner each year with changes in the climate. And all this can inform your decision-making for future seasons and future grazing plans. There are a few different ways to keep records of grazing. There's a grazing chart, which we'll look at, maps we'll look at as well, and then just using a simple calendar system, and they all work. So now we'll look at some examples and things to look for. So to use a grazing plan to plan for the upcoming season, for things in the future, you'll want to have a few things. This on the top left is a grazing calculation sheet that we use to help inform a grazing plan. So this is used to calculate the amount of acres that each grazing group will need per day. Or you can do a reverse calculation to find out how many animals a certain amount of land or pasture will support. And we'll need those numbers in order to fill out the grazing chart. And then it's really useful to have a map as well, and to have the acreage of all your different pastures or paddocks measured out. This map also has some ideas of different paddock divisions drawn in. And then down at the bottom is the UVM version of a grazing chart, and there are lots of different versions. So here's an example of a grazing chart for a sheep dairy, and it's a little hard to see because it's so small, but on the left are all the pasture or paddock names, their sizes and acreage, their quality, so that could be poor, medium, or good, or it could be the actual dry matter available per acre, which is helpful to know. And then from left to right are the months of the grazing season. This one is May through November. And so this is an example of how to plan around important events. I'll also point out there's spaces to keep track of other important data on here as well: rainfall, snow, daily temps, and just notes at the bottom. And this, for this particular farm, this first row and this third row are just two different possible grazing scenarios for the same exact farm. So it's just the paddocks are broken down slightly differently. So planning around important events, this sheep dairy has an orchard that they like to graze, an apple orchard, but there are food safety regulations around when livestock can be in that in that orchard. And so they've got to graze the orchard first thing in the spring, even before kind of normal turnout, like 1st of May, and then late in the fall after the fruit is harvested. So that first red box is just the orchard paddock. It shows that they'll be in there May 1st through 15th, and then not in there again until early November after the apple harvest. And then for the remainder of the season, the sheep will be moving among all the other different paddocks. And that's a pretty simple example of planning around an event with your grazing chart. So here's the same farm, same grazing chart with an example of how to plan the ideal timing to clip or hay. Let's see if we can make sense of this on PowerPoint. So in the red box here, this is the home field. It's one of their pastures. They first graze it in mid-May for 9 days, and then they graze all their other pastures and don't come back to home field until late July, which means that there's a 60-day rest period in between those two grazings of that pasture. And it's happening in June, July, when the recovery period is about 30 days. So by the time they get back to home field, things are going to be headed out, stemmy, less nutritionally dense for these animals and less palatable as well. So we can count backwards and forwards to find this sweet spot right here where it would be great to clip or make hay. They're not going to make hay because it's such a small field, and clipping will just leave down some extra organic matter for fertility. So they'll wait about 20 to 25 days to allow for regrowth after the first grazing, because in May and June that regrowth is a little faster, and then clip. And then after the clipping, there will be an adequate 35 to 40 days in June, July, when the regrowth period is a little slower, and they'll come back to graze it. And hopefully that pasture will be at a much better vegetative state than if they had waited the full 60 days to revisit. Here's an example of a grazing chart that has been filled out. So those last charts we looked at were just planning for the upcoming season. They were just penciled in plans about possible ways to go. And this chart is from Amber Reed, who's a grazing specialist at UVM as well. And she has a meat sheep farm in Barnet. And so she uses pencil brackets as well to show where her plans are, and then uses green pencil to color in where she actually grazed, and she uses red pencil to color in where she ended up feeding out hay. So this first arrow is pointing at just a discrepancy between plans and then what actually happened. So she had planned to turn out on May 13th and actually turned out on May 17th. And this just highlights the way that that first penciled out plan is really just an idea, and that with grazing, you're going to have to be flexible and have lots of backup plans. So that essentially shifted the whole grazing plan, 4 days later, and there's going to be lots of other shifts that happen. There's no way to know in advance what the weather or season will be like: hot year, dry year, wet year. So yeah, really holding that plan lightly as a good way to estimate if you'll have enough to meet your needs, but knowing that you're going to have to be flexible. So another example of reality being different than the plan is here in the second half of August. So Amber had planned to graze the Sumac Hill from mid-August to early September, a couple weeks. And what she ended up doing was feeding out 15 bales in her solar field. And she made a note down at the bottom: bale grazing to give grass a rest for longer rotation. So it was drier than expected here, or the growth rates were just slower than expected. So rather than push through and really limit, damage the grass and limit the amount of pasture that it would be available later in the season, Amber pulled them out of the rotation, fed hay, and then was able to do perhaps graze a little bit longer in the season because of that. So charts are one way to do it, but maps are a great other way to do it if people think in all different ways. So a map works just as well. This is an example of the same sheep dairy and orchard. And the Natural Resources Atlas is a great way to be able to measure out the acreage of your fields and perimeters as well. So here's their farm with all the different pastures measured out in acreage. And then an example of how to write in just the dates of either where you're planning to go when, or what you actually did, as well as writing in important dates like clipping or haying. And on the A&R Atlas, you can also draw in these lines to designate your different paddocks or your planned grazing rotation, and the blue is the water line here. And I didn't show an example because it's pretty self-explanatory, but the last way to keep grazing records would just be using a simple calendar that you can hang somewhere easy, the milk house, and write in the dates of when you're in each pasture, when you leave, and then important dates about clipping, haying, spreading, any other notes that might be related to your grazing plan. And that's all I've got. So I'll stop sharing. There we go. And I'll pass it over to Zac now.
Okay, is my screen up?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, my name is Zac Smith. I'm just gonna talk a little bit about our related Clean Water Initiative program that we do with the Extension Ag Business program. And today I wanted to just talk about our experiences with water quality improvement best practices. The Ag Business team, we work with all farms in Vermont, including forest and maple enterprises, but we do focus a lot on dairy and livestock farms. What we do is we work and offer planning and educational resources that increase the decision-making capabilities on farms. Our methodology is primarily what we really like to do is work one-on-one with farmers or farm teams, but we do also work in small groups, and we also offer online learning activities. Our programs and our research provide direction for key stakeholders to advance initiatives that improve business outcomes in a dynamic agricultural sector. The Clean Water Initiative program funds, tracks, and reports on priority projects to restore Vermont's waters. This is a multi-agency collaboration, and we primarily focus on the required agricultural practices, or otherwise known as RAPs. Some examples of water quality improvements on farms that we support are nutrient management planning for certified small farm operations, medium farm operations, and large farm operations. Soil sampling for farms. We help planning for runoff and collection systems management for surface or groundwater. Soil health, erosion control requirements. And a big one is manure and nutrient storage and application. We work on planning and around creating buffer zones, livestock exclusion areas, and farm structures. So our ag business program, what we do is we'll work with all dairy and livestock as well as non-dairy farm owners to assess and plan for business changes to meet these water quality goals that they have on their farms. Topics for our business support include cash flow and budget analysis, current business situation analysis, assessing the adoption of new practices and new investments, short and long-term strategic planning, farm transfer or exit planning, and referrals to other in-depth business planning programs when necessary. There are a lot of programs in the state that we can basically identify for farms in the case that they should fall into the category of supports that these agencies and departments work in. a little bit about, just how we do our project planning and like in collaboration with farmers is after a farmer reaches out to us, we always like to set up a meeting on the farm. That's just the best way to get to know everything that's going on the farm, introduce ourselves. We also explain too that, like a little bit about the program, which this program, our assessments and our planning and our dedication to the process is all free. And we are non-regulatory. We're just working with you to resolve an issue that you have or you may foresee that the farm has. So we like to establish a rapport, get to know you on the farm, and then we move into an actual assessment of what's going on the farm. We want to do an inspection of the farm. We want to, with us and the farmers, we want to identify the issue or the possible issues on the farm. And then we also want to look at the farm's viability. And when I say viability, I mean, how's the farm doing? And so we want to look at just the general condition of the farm, understand the urgency of certain issues on the farm, just so we know how much we need to dedicate to these issues. The next steps is we put together a resource review. When I say resource review, we want to know about how you're funding. I mean, how you're funding everything currently. How's your cash flow going right now? What do you have available? We'll take a quick look at your balance sheets, and then we'll also look at your personnel. Who's involved? See who are the people that are going to be making the decisions. Who are the people that we can include for improvements on the farms? And then after we get an understanding of a scenario of where we're at, we start looking at the possible funding sources. We continue to put out a lot of information on a variety of different grants and loans and alternative funding sources that can be offered to farmers in Vermont. So we look at all of those sources and find out where we could best apply funding sources to resolve your water quality issues on your farm. So once we understand where you stand financially and what funding sources are out there, we then start to put together some financial forecasting to just look at the implications that this could have on your farm. When I say implications, I mean that sometimes there are certain percentages of matching funds that the farm will need to put up for these projects. So we want to make sure that the farm knows all of the expenses that are going to be coming in or that are going to be confronting the farm. And we want to make sure that the farm can fit this into their cash flows. And also in many cases too, we want to see if these water quality improvements could actually improve any forms of income on the farm. So we want to look at, not just on the expense side, even though that's where we start, we also want to look at the revenue side, just to make sure that we're very sure on cash flows. Once we understand financial implications for certain undertakings, we come up with an action plan. We make a decision on what we want to do, which issues to, many times there are several issues that we need to address on a farm. So we prioritize the issues and start with step one through as many steps necessary and create an action plan. Within that action plan, we have to define who the key stakeholders are. This doesn't just mean the people on the farm. This may include enlisting the help of engineers, other agencies and departments and their resources. So we need to know everybody that's going to be involved, when they need to come in this timeline, and develop an implementation timeline. So we know everything that needs to get done and when it needs to get done and who it needs to get done by. And once you start implementing the water quality improvement on the farm, we also recommend a final phase, which is making sure that you're monitoring everything and making sure that you understand if the water quality issue is improving, and number two, if there's anything else that needs to be done and also examining and making sure that you're financially sustainable throughout all this process and moving forward. If you ever have any questions in regards to this, please feel free to reach out to our team. I will share a link in a follow-up email, but we're always available to address any issues, even if you have just something that you might feel is a simple question. Myself and Tony Kitsos and our team are available to address anything that you might have as far as concerns on the farm. And that's it for me.